Hello, and welcome to the Final Girls podcast. This is Anna, co-founder of the Final Girls and your podcast host. If you're new to the show, this podcast takes on a horror trope and explores this in depth through discussions with special guests. Currently, on our main season, we're looking at vampires, and previously we've covered witches and female monsters. Alongside our main season, on the podcast, we also cover selected new films or series that we really want to talk about. And every so often, I get to chat to the filmmakers who made them. Today's bonus episode is kind of like that, but with a twist. Because in this episode, we're not covering a new horror film or a new horror TV show, but instead the horror audio series Sour Hall, directed and written by Laura Kirwan-Ashman and available on Audible. For those of you who haven't heard about Sour Hall yet, for anyone who's not heard about this yet, Sour Hall is the folk horror-esque story of a lesbian couple, George and Ash, who moved from Manchester to a remote farm that George has inherited from her family. They're very isolated, the villagers are kind of hostile, and weird things start happening. Never thought I'd quote the Daily Mail on this podcast or anywhere, but to quote a Daily Mail headline, it's about a lesbian couple haunted by ghosts. Now, if you haven't listened to Sour Hall yet and you might need some convincing, there are no spoilers in this interview, and frankly, it's really fascinating to hear from Laura if you're interested in audio, in writing, and storytelling, and boggarts. Laura and I chatted about her relationship with genre, the making of an immersive audio project, and the importance of empathy in storytelling. Sour Hall is a 6-part horror audio series available now on Audible. I really enjoyed it. It's got an immersive, creepy feeling that genuinely sent chills down my spine. There was at least 3 or 4 moments where I literally had to throw my headphones off of my head because it was getting intense. I genuinely really recommend it. And for full effect, absolutely put your headphones on to get properly creeped out. With that said, please enjoy my conversation with Sour Hall's writer and director, Laura Kirwan-Ashman. Laura, thank you so much for making the time to chat to me today. How are you?
I'm good. I'm tired, but I'm always tired. So fine. But yeah, thanks for having me. It's gonna be cool to talk to someone who actually knows horror.
Well, I have to say, and we've spoken about this before, but it truly proper freaked me out, which is A, unusual for almost all horror stuff, and B, very unusual for audio stuff.
Yeah.
So double congratulations on that front.
Thanks. Yeah. It really means a lot coming from you. I was like, I definitely want Anna to listen to it because I feel like you're the only one of like the people that I know who's like horror is like your thing, and it's not my thing. So I was like, I need Anna to tell me if this is actually working on a sort of horror level. So yeah, it makes me really happy to hear that it did for you.
I think I told you already, but yeah, the first time, halfway through the drama, I didn't really know how to call it. Had you call it an audio drama, a horror drama, an audio book?
Yeah, I mean, they like Audible calling them podcasts, but when I think of podcasts, I think of like this, basically like people just chatting, like nonfiction. So I just call it an audio series. It's a horror.
Okay, let's call it that.
Yeah.
Let's stick with audio series. I like that because audio drama kind of seems a little old-timey, but an audio series
it feels a bit Archers. Yeah.
So you kind of hinted at it before, but I wanted to ask you, what is your relationship with horror?
I mean, I've spent my whole life just being like, horror's not for me. I'm a massive baby. I hate that sort of sick feeling of anticipation. I find it very, very stressful and like not enjoyable. But I think sort of over the past, few years with this kind of, I guess the sort of like Jordan Peele school of horror, where it's very much sort of the horror element is couched within this sort of wider psychological, socio-political context, that I can get into, and I can really enjoy that, because it for me, I think it's horror that is purely designed to be horror. I can't enjoy because it feels like assaultive. And I'm just like, I don't want to sit in a dark room and like be assaulted for like 2 hours, because it feels like a lot of it is purely designed first and foremost to scare you, to like give you nightmares for weeks and like make you shit your pants. And I personally don't enjoy that. I know that lots of people do. But with this sort of like, I guess like gentler kind of story horror, that's sort of seen this kind of wave in the past like few years, that works for me more, because it draws me in from a story and a character and a thematic point of view, and then the horror kind of works as just another sort of storytelling element to support the overall, vision for the film, and it's not trying to like terrorize me in the same sort of direct way, I guess, if that makes any sort of sense. So in the last few years, I've got into it more and sort of tested what I can like handle, and I think that's my groove. I found that's the kind of horror I can deal with, but I think I'm still traumatized from like, I think the one horror that I saw in the cinema, because I genuinely avoided it like the plague, and then my friend took me to see a film and basically just like didn't tell me what it was. It was like the middle of the day, and it was me and my friend, and then this one guy down the front. We were the only person in the cinema, and it was The Descent.
Oh my god!
Which is not a film that you want to go into blind. Like, and I have no gauge if people who are into horror, I don't know if that's actually a scary film that horror fans find scary, but that film horrified. I spent the entire time just like punching my friend in the arm, just out of like stress and rage and like hatred for the fact that she like was putting me through this. But also the thing with that, and that film has stayed with me so much, I think, because of the way the sort of fake out ending that it has, which is like the sort of, just like double whammy of like, you think it's kind of okay, and then they like pull one last rug out from underneath you, and it's just complete despair. And you're just like, oh god. So but also like it has stayed with me, so part of me suspects that it is actually a really good film, but I've never rewatched it. So I can't tell you, but I do think about it a lot, and it has stayed with me over the years, not just because it was like an upsetting experience, but as a sort of film I found it interesting. But so that's my sort of
so interesting
experience with horror.
That's really interesting. I mean, this is an audio series project. So do you have an affinity for audio first projects like podcast, audio dramas? You're shaking your head like no.
No, I mean, I feel like this is like vaguely unprofessional of me to say, but I'm still kind of just like unsure of like how the hell I got this job, because I'm like, I don't know anything about audio. I don't really listen to audio series. I have a few choice like podcasts that I listen to, but most of them are just like, like one or two people talking about something I find interesting. And so like audio as a sort of genre is not something that I've ever sort of paid much attention to or been particularly engaged with. So I don't know how my first ever sort of series commission, my first ever like big writing project, ended up being an audio horror. It's I love it. See it coming, but here we are. It's been great.
I mean, I find it doubly impressive that as someone who doesn't really isn't really into audio first projects, or isn't really that into horror, although by the way that you describe it, I feel like it's just it's by choice.
Yeah.
you choose not to have your senses assaulted by films on a borderline daily basis like I do. It's a life choice. It's fine.
Yeah,
it's okay.
It's purely non-judgmental. I understand like the psychology behind why people enjoy horror, but it just personally not for me.
What I mean to say is that I find it doubly impressive that you can create something that works so well in in the audio medium and within the horror genre without being a fan necessarily of either one of those.
Yeah. Thanks.
So let's talk a little bit more in depth about Sour Hall, because I've got a ton of questions, and we're gonna try to not spoil anything because I want this episode for anyone who hasn't heard about it, and this is mainly a film and TV podcast anyway, but I want people to listen to it because I think it's really, really creepy and it's really, really great. So what can you tell me kind of about the story behind this audio series? So as far as I understand, it's expanded from a chapter, a tale within a pre-existing project called Hag, right?
Yeah. So Hag was basically an anthology that Audible commissioned as a sort of just an audio anthology of sort of feminist retellings of English folk tales, basically. So a bunch of writers were commissioned to sort of take an English folk tale and create a new story from it. And so Sour Hall was one of those stories. So it was the short stories written by Naomi Booth, who is a Yorkshire writer. So she sort of created the characters of Ash and George and this sort of moving to a farm and starting a dairy business and being tormented by a boggart. So all that sort of the framework of the story came from Naomi Booth. And then Audible, I think because they are doing much more sort of original commissioning, they decided that Sour Hall was the story from Hag that they wanted to sort of expand and commission a writer to turn into a full sort of dramatic series. So yeah, and then that's basically when I came on board.
And how did you start approaching expanding this short story into a 6-part series?
It's kind of strange. A lot of people ask me this and I still don't have like a particularly good answer for it other than like just making more of it. Like it's because I mean the original short story is like 18 A4 pages when they sent it to me.
How did you start approaching writing it for audio? Like, what was the main differences that you found in expanding a short story, which, you know, essentially is the equivalent of a short film, into the equivalent of 2 feature films, a 3-hour story?
What was quite cool is that, like, because I hadn't written audio before, I was like quite worried about, like, I was just like, I don't know how to write in this format. Like, it took me long enough to learn how to write screenplays, a very specific, you know, technical formatted document. And Audible were very much like, don't worry so much about that. You basically just have to, obviously, you know, you remove the visual element, but in terms of like how you format the script, like approach it like a sort of normal screenplay. And also you can write in, you know, character movement. And because of the way that they knew that they wanted to record it, they wanted to record it on location. They wanted to record it in this very immersive way with this sort of 360 sound design. So they were like, more so with this project, you can kind of write it like a film, because we will be able to like do the equivalent of like a tracking shot, and we will be able to like run with the characters and stuff like that. So it was a concern of mine at the beginning, but very quickly that kind of fell away. The one of the sort of downsides in terms of just making it a more intense task is that when you remove all the visual elements from like a script, you basically have to write more. So if you look at like a page of script for a visual film, like a lot of that is going to be like visual descriptions. You take all that out and you have a lot more space on the page that you have to then fill. So it's a lot more kind of actual writing, especially in terms of dialogue. But I think it was cool for me because I am a very dialogue heavy writer. That's naturally how I sort of write things, especially on a sort of first go. I tend to over rely on dialogue, and then I end up having to like do a lot of editing. So it was quite nice to have like the free reign of like, yeah, this is all about the dialogue, but that doesn't mean that, you know, it can be shit or it can be, it's like, it has to be, and the other thing is that like you have to be naturally more expository than you would with film. So film is all about like show, don't tell. So like don't explain things to the audience if you can show it visually. It makes the audience feel stupid. Like, whereas like with audio, because you don't have that visual stimulus, you kind of have to use the dialogue to position people in the room, to let people know like what is happening. But you have to find the balance between doing that and making it sound awful. So you can't be like, oh, here comes Jim walking into the room, like, you know,
step. Yeah.
Stuff like that. So it's like, obviously that's a terrible example. But yeah, you have to find a way to like give the audience the information they need to understand like who is in the room, what is happening, what is the relation between people, like if there are objects, like what are those, like just, you know, the basic sort of things that you would see immediately if you had the visuals to rely on. But again, without making it sound ridiculous. So yeah, so those were the kind of like biggest differences, I guess, between sort of writing for film and television and writing for audio.
And then you mentioned you've already indicated the making of it with 360 sound. Can you talk a little bit about the actual directing of it and this approach to making it with using this particular technology and what it meant for you to actually be thinking about it in that way? Because it is audio, but it's audio in even as a listener, it felt incredibly creepy in a way that I couldn't pinpoint until I read up that it was recorded using 360 tech. Yeah. Or I don't even know what the proper name for it is.
Yeah, I mean, I don't either. I mean, basically, it's binaural 360 3D sound.
Fancy.
Yeah. So it's basically like if you're familiar with, if anyone listening is familiar with like ASMR videos, so it's basically microphones that capture sounds that makes it feel that as if the sound is happening to you in a very sort of like real way, like it moves from ear to ear, it goes around the back of your head, it can come in from different directions, you get a sense of how far away the source of the sound is or how close. So it's basically that, but what the thing that we used is it's a dummy head, and basically what it is it's a head that has been designed basically using like thousands of measurements of human heads to find like the average human head, and then it has these sort of like silicone ears, and they're very, very realistic. They look and sort of feel like real human ears. And again, those are sort of designed to be like the average human ear. So then what you have is a sort of dummy head that filters and records and processes sound the way that your actual head and ears do. So that's why when you record around it, what it does is it puts the listener very like physically and viscerally in that space. So what we use that for is basically all the sort of boggart stuff. And so basically whenever the boggart is speaking, or whenever anyone that the boggart is possessing is speaking, all that stuff we recorded both with just like a normal boom mic and with the dummy head. So then when it comes to the sound mix, you can mix all that stuff in, you can layer it, you can move from like the boggart voice into the person that it's possessing, and, you know, all this incredible stuff that Eloise from Naked Productions did in the mix. She's an absolute wizard. So that's kind of how the binaural sound worked, and it just results in a very kind of immersive, creepy, visceral effect when you don't have the visuals to rely on. But obviously, as I'm sure you know, like, sound design is such a huge part of horror, you know, on film and TV. You know, sound is a very thing that makes us feel very strongly. So when all you have is audio to rely on, it was just another sort of like tool in the box, basically, to just make it as creepy as possible and have voices move from one ear to the other and feel like it's on the back of your neck or suddenly come at you from a distance, you know, all that kind of stuff.
No, like, even as you talked about it, I felt on the nip of my neck again, and no thank you. I wanted to ask you, because I've seen the pictures of the filming on an actual farm somewhere. What was it like to direct it? Because I would always imagine, and all the audio stuff that I've seen or listened to has usually been recorded in studios, kind of in sound booths, whatever. So it seemed like quite an unusual way to approach recording an audio series. Can you talk a little bit about, like, how was it valuable? Did it add to it? And how was it to be on location with actors and with the binaural dummy, but still only be capturing sound?
It's really, really rare. It basically just never happens that you record audio on location, because I mean, audio is kind of like, it's a very cheap medium for a reason. You know, you basically just need, you know, a sound booth and a microphone, and that's it. But I think Audible were very, very into this idea of, like, if we're going to do a horror, we want to do everything possible to make it as sort of immersive and realistic and creepy as possible. And so, they basically facilitated us being able to stay on a farm in Yorkshire. And this was in October. So did all the COVID testing, and we basically like formed a bubble. And I think it was incredibly valuable for both me and the actors. And so this, again, was another first for me, and wonderful that Audible sort of put their faith in me and allowed me to direct it, because I'd never directed fiction before. I've made a few documentaries, but this was my first time sort of working with actors. So for me, it was an incredible sort of introduction to that, and sort of like the perfect sort of introduction, because it is audio, and you're not having to worry about like the visual elements. You're not having to worry about the cinematography and the sets and the locations and, you know, the blocking in the same way. Like, my job was purely just to work with the actors. So it was amazing for me to have sort of all the other pressures that would come with, you know, making a short film, for example, lifted away, and just be like, this is your first time working with actors, but that's all you have to worry about. So that was incredible. And then, it was just valuable for both me and the actors to be actually on location, because I think when you're recording audio and you're just in a sort of like blank, you know, dark sound booth, it requires a lot of imagination on the actor's part and on the director's part. And also, you don't have the sort of physical sounds of, you know, location to kind of ground you. It's just like, on the script, it's just like, oh, you're on a farm and wind is howling, and so you have to conjure all that stuff up for yourself, you know. But we could actually do that stuff. We could be outside, and we had the wind howling, and it would be cold, and it would be raining, and you would just be in the middle of nowhere in Yorkshire. So all that stuff, I think, really helped with the actors to sort of just ground them in the location and help them to sort of embody the characters and the situations a lot more. And all the actors were just like absolutely thrilled, like to be like out of the house, like just, you know, in a pandemic, and be able to doing something, because most of them have been like recording stuff like in their closets under duvets for months. And yeah, none of them had ever recorded audio on location in quite this immersive way. And yeah, it was just wonderful. It just so felt like we were at this like weird kind of like camp, like not summer because it was October and it was freezing, but like winter camp. Horror camp. Yeah, exactly. And we were all staying together, and it was beautiful. It was so much fun.
And so, can you talk a little bit about your actors, Lucy Fallon and Pearl Mackie? Yeah. Like, what was the casting process like for them, with them?
I mean, the casting process was like pretty straightforward. I mean, I was not massively involved in that. Basically, like between Audible and the production company, who have much more experience with sort of actors and voice actors specifically, and actors who do a lot of voice work. So they have their own kind of databases of people that they think would be good. And then so they would send me sort of like a long list, and then we'd make short lists, and yeah, so that's you know, and then obviously there are like specific things, like obviously Ash is Black and very much a city girl, and whereas like Lucy is the one who is actually from Yorkshire, so it had to be an actor with that kind of accent, or who could do that kind of accent. And also with the two, because it is so much of it is a two-hander, you have to take into consideration like their voices can't be too similar. They have to have but they also have to be complementary. You know, they have to sound nice together, but also be easily extinguishable. Extinguishable? That's not the word.
Distinguishable.
Distinguishable. That's the one. I don't want to extinguish anyone. Yeah. So that was kind of the casting process. And then, yeah, a lot with most of the other sort of smaller parts, most of them, yeah, were all had to be able to do those kind of Yorkshire and Northern accents. And yeah, and have that's the right voice for the age of the characters and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, so it wasn't a particularly sort of involved or strenuous casting process.
Just we were chatting a little bit about this before we hit record, but like, what was it like directing them in that secluded atmosphere and only capturing audio? And I'm talking about kind of the whole cast in general, because even though they carry the majority of the story, it's not just them, and they're not the creepiest elements of Sour Hall.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was amazing for the actors to just physically be there, but also I think so basically the two characters that are sort of the creepiest are like obviously the boggart, and then the character of Thomas, who is a farmhand on the farm, who just has a kind of lurking, vaguely menacing presence sort of up until the penultimate episode, when his character sort of comes to a head in a very dramatic and creepy scenario. And that was so the boggart was just like the first time we heard the boggart voice the first thing we did was like a live read through, just we all sat in a room and read through the entire series from beginning to end. And the first time it came to Andy doing the boggart voice, he was just like, oh, you know, so this is just something I've just been like workshopping, like let me know if it's shit or not. And then just like launched like right into like the boggart voice that you hear. Just, like,
breathe it in, old man. The smoke will curdle your lungs.
And we were just like, oh my, and like he like embodied it like so physically, like he looked like Gollum. And everyone in the room was just like, that's horrifying. Like, how did you just come up with that by yourself? Like, what is wrong with you? And then it's so funny because he's literally the loveliest man you've ever met in your life, and just like so polite and charming, and just like, so he'd like go into the boggart voice and then like snap out of it and be like, was that good? And you're just like, what's happening right now? So yeah, I didn't have to do any work in terms of like working on that. We just came with that like fully prepared, and we were like, yeah, that's spectacular. And then so the guy who plays Thomas is the guy from Chewing Gum, the first season of Chewing Gum, her like sort of like dim-witted, basically like her like himbo boyfriend, like the shit poet on the estate, like the sweetest, but just not very bright. Like that's the guy who plays Thomas.
I'm not over this information.
So he was talking about like how both him and Andy were talking about how lovely and like refreshing it is for like them as actors to play like awful characters, or just creepy characters or villains, or just, you know. So yeah, so Rob was talking about how, especially for him, because I think he's most known for like that particular character, it was just like really cool and really nice to sort of stretch his acting muscles and play something that's like basically the polar opposite of that character. But yeah, it was, and I think like what's so cool about that binaural sound, that dummy head, is that like it kind of is like a person. So it's like this head on a pole. So like when we're recording, there's the scene in episode 5 where Thomas's character is you know, incredibly creepy towards Ash. She is in a situation where he's like sort of circling her and coming at her from all different angles. So like when we were recording that, we were like in a field, which is where the scene takes place, and Rob was like walking around the dummy head and coming in close and moving away and basically acting against the dummy head as if it was Ash. And then when we recorded Ash's part, he was acting against Ash. So it was like almost like, you know, we were filming it. It was kind of really, we were acting it out very physically. And the same with like, there's a scene where Ash gets buried by snow, and so we like put the dummy head like under these blankets and, you know, tried to get that muffled sound to record the boggart parts, and similarly like we've put the dummy head like in beds and things like that. So all that kind of stuff just like really helped like both me and the actors and the eventual sound mix to just be really, really effective, hopefully, and just really feel like the listener is really there. And especially with Ash, because so much of the story is, you know, we're experiencing it via Ash, and she's the sort of surrogate for the audience. So all that stuff really helps, you know, the audience to kind of really be in the moment with Ash and feeling what she's feeling and experiencing what she's experiencing.
Oh, absolutely. And I think kind of for me, one of the hidden powers of the story that doesn't really have to do with horror is Ash's empathy and how she is able to feel for almost everyone around her in the story and becomes kind of our surrogate as well for that. What was your thinking behind making her such an empathetic character?
Empathy is just like a sort of obsession of mine. It's really kind of shaped, I guess, my sort of like general life ideology, but also the sort of ideology that I apply to storytelling and the kind of stories that I want to put out in the world. And I feel like last year, you know, the first sort of half of last year and the first few months of lockdown was a personal process of me really kind of solidifying just what my sort of storytelling ideology is. And a lot of that has to do with this sort of obsession with empathy. And also kind of, I'm constantly trying to, you know, figure out what, you know, I call myself like a femgaze hope punk storyteller. And hope punk is a phrase that I came across last year that really just sort of perfectly summed up all this stuff that I had been thinking about. And so basically hope punk is a term that sort of was started by a writer on Tumblr, and sort of specifically talking about sort of fantasy and sci-fi and that kind of genre fiction. And it was basically the antithesis of like grimdark. So grimdark would be like Game of Thrones, you know, like everything's awful, people are terrible, everyone's stabbing each other in the back, like you have to be manipulative and you have to play the game, and you know it's all about like betrayal and just like the absolute worst qualities of humanity, which is like very compelling and interesting and rich stuff to explore from a storytelling perspective. But it is a very depressing and bleak worldview when you sort of, because obviously we use fiction to understand ourselves and the world around us. You know, that's literally what fiction is for. From the very earliest myths and religions, it's all telling stories about us to help us understand. And so the sort of fiction that we consume, or the fiction that sort of is what the current zeitgeist in Game of Thrones did kind of like dominate television for so many years. And it was also the same kind of period that like all the kind of really dark Batman films came out, for example. It was this very, very dark period of like storytelling, and also very, very masculine storytelling as well.
Very gritty.
Yeah,
that was the buzzword.
Yeah. And that kind of like, it's like, if it's dark, then it's therefore worthier than like other forms of storytelling, because it's gritty and it's realistic, and like it doesn't pull punches and it doesn't sugarcoat anything. And I'm just like, okay, but like I feel like we've kind of exhausted that. I think as the actual real world gets increasingly awful in 5,000 different ways, and I personally just found myself getting really exhausted with this kind of storytelling. And I think that was sort of a common theme, I think, and especially I think from like women and feminine people, and just basically anyone who's not just like a middle-aged cishet white dude. Like people are just like, okay, but like, is this all there is? Is this the pinnacle of storytelling? So I think that sort of how punk was sort of born out of like, okay, so what is the polar opposite of this kind of grim, dark storytelling? And how can we take the elements of this kind of storytelling and the things we love about it, and how can we apply that to the real world? So hope punk is basically the idea that actually the hardest and bravest thing you can do is really, truly care about people and things, and you believe that the world can be a better place, and fight for it every single day. And it's not just about one lone hero fighting the big battle, and then there's just one big battle and then everything's fine. Like hope punk acknowledges that the world does not work that way. It's a daily practice. You have to wake up every day and choose to be, try your best to be the best version of yourself, and do good things, and stand up for other people, and love and care, and foster a sense of community and selflessness instead of selfishness, and all these things that are like so often coded as like feminine traits, and all of it boils down to like empathy, right? And I've sort of just become obsessed with this idea that like empathy is so coded as like a feminine thing, when really like it's like it absolutely should not be that way, because humanity does not operate without empathy. Okay, like empathy is what our brains developed in order to be able to see other people as similar to ourselves, and that is the basis for all human connection and relationships and society, and everything that makes us differentiates us from like animals. But even animals have empathy. Sorry, I'm rambling. So like empathy is always something that I just like comes out in my storytelling, and I'm very into this idea of sort of positioning empathy as a kind of superpower, as something that is incredibly powerful and healing and so integral, but it's something that people just don't really talk about that much. It's sort of taken as a given, but it's like they've scientifically proven that like basically empathy is declining like within the human race, and has been for like decades and decades. And if you think about all the world's problems, everything boils down to a lack of empathy.
I couldn't agree more. And it's somewhat of a personal obsession as well. And in the way that it shows in storytelling, what I found really interesting about Sour Hole is that it's both very directly articulated as like empathy is the superpower, or the kind of the need for both George and Ash to mend their relationship and talk to each other, but also the thing that will unite them to face the supernatural horror that they're being what's the word that they're being haunted by. I wanted to talk a little bit as well about the way that Sour Hall kind of addresses trauma, which is the other big theme in it. And without spoiling the details of the story, it's addressed through a myriad of different ways and a myriad of different characters. How did you want to tackle a subject that is often taboo and is quite difficult to tackle in film and TV, in any fiction really, through the medium of horror?
So, I mean, I think this is the case for like any kind of genre storytelling. But I think, you know, for horror as well, I think the supernatural elements, the paranormal, the just like sort of heightened devices that come with sort of genre storytelling, they're all metaphors, right? They're all metaphors for the darkest parts of the human psyche, and whether that's the worst things that people do to each other, or the worst things that we do to ourselves internally, our subconscious, our shadow selves, our baggage, our trauma, our insecurities, our deepest fears and anxieties. This kind of storytelling takes those very internal things and like manifests them in the real world, whether it's via monsters or ghosts or, you know, whatever it is. So Sour Hall is kind of no different, and all those kind of elements of unresolved trauma and that being such a central theme was like in the original story from Naomi Booth. So I just sort of like took that stuff and just really ran with it. And the boggart was always kind of a physical manifestation of their both George and Ash's unresolved trauma. You know, George's sort of childhood and what she experienced on the farm, and Ash's kind of more recent trauma that she's experienced in the last year or so that she brings with her to Sour Hall. And the boggart sees Ash as a threat and therefore uses this sort of fresh trauma that she's brought with her in a suitcase, basically, to try and drive her away. And as a way of punishing George. So there's also sort of like weird jealousy, complex things going on from the boggart as well, which I feel like we don't get much of. I feel like supernatural elements are often just used as this is a way to torment the humans, you know? Whereas like I tried to treat the boggart as like a character in and of itself, with needs and desires and a history and a personality and you know, all that kind of stuff. And so it's basically like a sort of three-hander in that way. There's sort of three people in that relationship, and the three of them have to find a way to, you know, communicate basically and to reach a place of shared understanding if they are going to survive this, you know. I think because I approached it in that way and sort of from this sort of femme gaze perspective and always thinking about like empathy and emotion and the characters and the relationships, I think that's hopefully how I've avoided it being gratuitous, which so much of sort of especially trauma directed towards or experienced by women, I think especially in horror as well, often it feels like it's purely being done to like torment them for some sort of sick pleasure of the audience, whereas like this, you know, I'm really hoping that none of it feels gratuitous and that it feels you know, earned and is the place that it is leading towards kind of makes up for and feels healing for the trauma that they've experienced and that the audience have sort of experienced alongside them.
As a non-horror fan, and I mentioned at the beginning of our chat that I found it so impressive that you made it so genuinely creepy and terrifying without loving really the genre. And you know, I don't think that any artist, filmmaker, writer needs to be a fan of the genre that they're writing on necessarily. But I wanted to ask you, kind of, without the baggage that comes, the referential baggage that comes, or the tropes and all of those things, how did you approach making it creepy? Like, how did you find the horrific in Sarah Hall?
Yeah. I mean, it all came from character. I think, character is everything in any kind of storytelling of this kind. Of any kind, to be honest. The plot needs to come from the character. The relationship needs to come from the characters. The horror needs to come from the characters. So I think that's why once I actually sort of got over my whole, like, oh, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know horror. Like, why was I chosen for this? Like, once I sort of got into the actual writing of it and the sort of, coming up with like what was actually going to happen, at its core, it's still just very basic sort of storytelling skills. It's like you have to know your character well to understand what will scare them. So it wasn't that I was like, oh, I need to like reference a bunch of stuff, or I need to use these kind of horror tricks. I need to start from a place of like, okay, so Ash is a queer Black woman moving to the middle of nowhere in like rural Yorkshire. She's surrounded by white people. She doesn't know anyone. She's a city girl. She's recently had a traumatic experience that she's, recovering from and sort of in denial about in a lot of ways. What about all of that? What in all of that is going to like scare her? And therefore, because the audience is, hopefully, if I've done my job right, it's with Ash, it's going to scare the audience as well. And also, like, what is very specifically scary for women? The scene involving sort of Thomas and the Boggart and Ash in a field was very much just me as a woman being like, what is one of the worst situations within these parameters of the story that I can imagine? And it's, it's that feeling of helplessness, of being stuck, of being surrounded by someone who has ill intention towards you, and you are utterly at their, under their power. Basically, you can't do anything about it, and they are very specifically taunting and tormenting you in very sort of like gendered ways. So it was, it all came from sort of character and just like the basics of storytelling. And I think that's what any genre, when it works, it comes from those places. It's not just a tick list of like genre tropes or horror tricks or and then the sort of like that stuff comes from that. So we do have stuff like jump scares and bangs and things that I was like, okay, they're in a kitchen, what would be scary to happen? What would be a scary supernatural thing to happen in the kitchen? And you're like, oh, like all the cupboards bang open. I think that was actually in the original story. So it's like stuff like that. And you're like, okay, that also works for an audio point of view. So it all came from character and emotion and psychological stuff, and then everything else on top of that is sort of window dressing.
I'm conscious of your time, so to
it's
wrap
fine,
up,
I have no life. You definitely have more to do than I do. So it's all good.
No, I mean, I could talk about the series for a while because I'm so curious about the way that it was made as well, but I don't want to spoil too many details of it. It's out now, so all of the episodes are out now online on Audible. But what do you hope people get from it when they listen to it?
I hope that it feels refreshing in terms of this sort of femme gaze, hope punk approach to horror, and also just simple things like it's a story about lesbians and neither one of them dies, or like there's not trauma and tragedy that is specific to them being queer, or that is like specific to Ash being Black. Like obviously it creeps in and it's referenced, but it's not trauma porn based on any of those things that characters like that are often characters like that have to like earn their place within the story in terms of the dramatic worth that they provide, and that dramatic worth is so often tied to the trauma of their specific identities. And I didn't want to do any of that. I wanted to write a story that the trauma that they're, experiencing is just more generalized, or it's not specifically tied to race or sexuality or all the things that those people are historically punished for, and also just to sort of show that like something can be scary and have a happy ending. Like, it's I hope that's not too spoilery, but it's like it's very like it's sort of, I don't know, it's that was very important to me to be like, okay, if I'm going to do a horror and do an audio series and feel like I have no idea what I'm doing, like what is going to moor me and what is going to like anchor me and make this still feel like a Laura Kirwan-Ashman project. And so that's the kind of stuff that I feel like I specifically brought to it and sort of added to it to make it sort of this new iteration of a pre-existing story. So I hope that people sort of listen to it and feel like, oh, I didn't expect that, and that feels good. And like, it's a horror story and it's about trauma and it is very upsetting in a lot of ways, but I actually feel good and I feel hopeful and I feel like I have some faith in humanity. But at the end of it, which is I feel like not the general vibe that people walk away from horror with, I guess. I don't know. You tell me. I mean, I feel like usually it's like, oh, everything's awful. Like,
well, sometimes the best horrors also leave you hopeful. Yeah. It's more like hopeful horror, but I think a lot of it as well comes from the creators. Yeah. And even as I was listening to it, and even knowing that horror is not necessarily your jam, it did feel like a you project. So I think that definitely comes through. But for anyone who may have not seen your previous work before, where can people find more of your work online?
Yeah, so my very limited work is you can find it on...
Pump yourself up, Laura.
There's just like not that much of it. But so you can go to lauraki-a.com. It's my website. You can see my sort of little documentaries I've made. You can find me on Twitter at Laura _K_A and Instagram at Laura K_A.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Anna. This was so fun.